Hi, this is Randall Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Simon Phipps joins me. We're going to be talking about something that is so old it's been in the making for 20 years. DOS, but a free version of that. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for FLOSS Weekly is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randall Schwartz and Simon Phipps. Episode 416, recorded January 3rd, 2017. FreeDOS. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randall Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you each week, well, pretty close anyway, the movers, the shakers, the big projects, the little projects, projects you may be using every day and not aware of it, projects you may want to download right after the show and find out how you can play with it. Today's project being no exception. But first, let me bring on my wonderful and talented co-host. Some would say lovely co-host, but I will say wonderful and talented, Simon Phipps. Welcome back to the show.
I'm flattered as ever, Randall. Thank you. Well, have a very happy new year to you. Let's hope that 2017 doesn't suck quite as much as 2016 did.
I don't see how it could, but okay. We are setting the bar pretty low for it not sucking as bad as 2016. There are so many things wrong with 2016 and probably will continue on there. You survived the leap second, apparently.
Yeah, I'm still here. I vaulted the leap second. I'm a veteran of Y2K, so I was able to cope with that.
Yeah, and apparently Cloudflare had a really bad leap second problem. They actually had outages over some part of their networking just because of the crazy leap second. And because of the Go programming language, but I can point fingers at Go later. But Go seemed to have no way to get monotonic time in its core library. And you would think that monotonic time for a systems programming language would be useful these days. But no, because of the way the leap second worked, apparently the time went backwards for a number of servers all over the world that used Go. Anyway, enough of that. So today
wouldn't have happened with Perl, would it, Randall? Nothing bad would have happened.
No. I'm sure there's monotonic time in Perl. It's just probably requires the installation of something from one of the modules. So it's probably not in the core library. You probably have the same problems with core Perl that you would have with core Go. So I know I can't justify it completely with that. Well, we are talking about Time Day. We're talking actually about something that is timeless and timely, both. We're going to be talking about DOS, and specifically FreeDOS, the freely available open implementation of DOS. I have never actually owned a machine that ran DOS. I've only typed DOS commands in the window that comes up when you ask for a terminal window in Windows, and typically the only commands I would type there are ifconfig or netstat to try to figure out if the Windows machine that I was forced to use at some client's location could actually talk to the internet. Simon, what do you know about DOS? You got to watch the video for this one.
I have in my hand my DOS 5 upgrade discs that still read. I used to use DOS frequently. I was a system programmer at Burroughs in the 1980s. We used CPM, and then these crazy IBM machines came out with this silly DOS thing that wasn't anywhere near as good as CPM, so I had to use that too. And I've had DOS systems. I've produced commercial software for DOS. I have somewhere still got all the programming manuals for writing DOS extensions here. So I've done a bit of DOS stuff, but not since I last used Microsoft things in 2005.
Awesome. And so the original DOS, of course, was proprietary and came out of the halls of Redmond, as we like to call them occasionally, the Microsoft locations, MS-DOS, in fact, being its name. So the MS referring, of course, to Microsoft. And then they went on to make Windows and all the other things that have happened since then. But again, I've never owned a machine that came with Windows in my life. So I don't know anything much about Windows, don't know much about DOS. But I know somebody who knows a ton about it. It would be our guest today coming on in just a few minutes, Jim Hall, who has been around DOS for much longer than I have, is trivial to be around longer than zero. They let anybody do this show. And then, but he's been around and started the FreeDOS project back in 1994. So not only do we have an old application that's being emulated with open source software, it's also probably one of the oldest open source software projects. Do you want to make a comment on that while I clear my throat there, Simon?
I often wonder why anyone would really need a FreeDOS. And then I discovered that I couldn't use any of my software because Microsoft were gradually changing DOS, so my software didn't work anymore. And now having FreeDOS around is a really good thing, along with a copy of Wine as well, which I use for archival Windows programs. So I think it's a great thing that it exists. I'm slightly vaguely surprised that people are still excited about it, but I'm sure that we're going to find out from Jim exactly why it's so exciting today.
Well, not only that, but we've had a lot of chatter in the chat room already. We have a live chat room that we have along with taping these shows and about the impact of DOS and how FreeDOS in particular has opened up some opportunities for that. So without further ado, we could sit here and chat all day, but we have an expert on the line. Jim Hall, welcome to the show.
Well, hello.
Hi, and where are you speaking to us from?
I'm speaking to you from work, actually. So I apologize for the very stark background for me, but I'm calling you from St. Paul, Minnesota.
St. Paul, Minnesota, the Twin Cities. I have been there a few times. Former home of Prince. Well, it's still the home of Prince's estate, I guess. So yeah. Sorry about all that. One of the things.
We are sort of the capital of snow. It's kind of like we're a very cold area right now. It's quite cold.
I have been there a couple of times. I taught classes at the Cray computer facility down I don't know where it's, down in the south end of the city. So that was back in the day, though. Back in the day when Cray had their headquarters there. Now Cray is just a footnote somewhere, I presume. Anyway, so we could chat about old stuff. Actually, you and I could probably go back through our collective histories and fill an entire 2 or 3 shows, but that's not why I'm here. Let's step back a bit, talk about FreeDOS. How did it get started and what problem was it solving?
Yeah, it's okay. So back, I was a big DOS user back in the day. We had a kind of back a little bit further than that. We had an Apple computer. That was my first introduction to computing, and my brother and I taught ourselves to write programs on that Apple computer. But then we replaced that with an IBM PC, and I learned to program on that. Still, it was basic, but I became a real DOS user, I'd say, with that first 86, I think it was, and then we got the 286 and the 386. And I did everything in DOS because that was really what you had. And then I went to college and I was a physics student, and I used DOS for everything. I mean, I wrote all my papers using a DOS word processor. A lot of you probably remember the WordPerfect word processor. I used that for a while, then I switched over to a shareware program called Galaxy Write. I did all my lab analysis in a DOS spreadsheet called As Easy As, which is a shareware spreadsheet equivalent to Lotus 123. As Easy As 123, right? Do you get it?
Yes.
So I just did everything in DOS, including gaming. I would, there's just a ton of great DOS games, and I programmed little utilities here and there that would make my life easier in DOS, and I was just a sort of a power user. I had discovered Linux, but I still did most of my work in DOS. And then in 1994, Microsoft started doing all these press interviews and whatnot with tech magazines, and they said that the next version of Windows is going to completely do away with DOS. MS-DOS is dead. And I don't know if you remember what Windows looked like back in 1994. 94, ugly. That was Windows. Yeah, it was ugly. Windows 3.1. It was not great. And I remember saying, I just didn't use Windows because Windows 3.1 kind of sucked. But I remember saying that if the next version of Windows, if Windows 4 or 3.2 is going to look anything like Windows 3.1, I don't want anything to do with it. And so I was still an undergraduate student, and I think in my naivete, I think I kind of looked at it and said, why can't we write our own version of DOS? And I think if I had waited a couple of years, if that had happened a couple of years later when I had a job and stuff and didn't have as much available time, I think that might have happened differently. But I said, man, I've been running Linux, and Linux is a full operating system, multitasking, and and everything else. And gosh, if the Linux people can do it, we can do something as simple as DOS, right? It's a single tasking operating system. We can do that.
Yeah.
I've written a number of utilities already. So, I just said, let's just make our own DOS. And that's really how it started. I said something on Usenet. That was how you discuss stuff online at the time. And I said, does anybody else have a free DOS? Does anybody else want to write a free version of DOS? And the response was basically, that's a good idea, and you should do it. And so I did. And so I put something out there, and people liked it, and they, it was very crude at the beginning, but we got a lot of people that saw that there was something there, and they joined the project. And over the next couple of months, I don't know, we had a whole bunch of people who joined in and wrote a new command com and a new this and that. We scoured different FTP sites looking for free software. It was public domain stuff at the time. Stuff that would reproduce or actually enhance the behavior of MS-DOS. And that's kind of where it got started. Just people kind of come together and saying, yeah, we can give that a shot. We can make that work. And we did.
So do you ever look back and think, wow, if I just hadn't made that one choice back then, how many more spare hours I would have had in my life?
If it had been, I think it's like 6 months later when I had my first job, and I just would not have had the free time. And I think 6 months later it would have been a different story. But I was a student with lots of free time, and I felt like I could do it all, and I gave it a try. Sometimes that's what you got to do. That's what I did.
The world is run by crazy people, and you're apparently one of them, and I appreciate that. So thank you. But just so we can bring the kids up to date, because I think there's probably some people here that don't realize the significance of what you were saying in terms of DOS being sort of your basic UI, back before they called them UIs even. Right. And then that Windows essentially had some version of DOS inside of it. It would run all the existing DOS programs, but then they were talking about getting rid of DOS in past the 3.1 phase. So when you were talking about DOS being in Windows, what is it you're interacting with there?
So DOS is a very old operating system. It's probably one of the oldest operating systems for the PC. CP/M is a little older, but DOS as an operating system is a very simple operating system, and it's completely command line. Because DOS, when you look at it, it stands for disk operating system, because at the beginning it ran on floppies, and it was just intended to get you to run the computer so you could run applications, and that's kind of what DOS is really there to do. It's really there to start up the computer and let you run applications. It's you live at the command line. Well, you're intended to live at the command line. I think this is sort of the MS-DOS vision. You're intended to live at the command line long enough to start an application that you'll actually do the rest of your work in. And so the computer would boot up. It would be very text mode. You're going to see the C:\\/ greater than symbol. That's your prompt, right? C: is your drive, and / is the root directory of the C drive. And from there you go into whatever directory you need to go into that has an application, and you just run the application. It's single tasking. So when you run that application, when you run WordPerfect, when you run Spreadsheet, when you run a communications program, that's all that's running. You're not multitasking. There's no multitasking in DOS. And so you are intended to run it one application at a time. There were some other bolt-ons like desk view and whatnot that did provide some multitasking, but as an operating system concept, DOS was really meant to be text mode, single user, single task, and just there to let you run an application. It had some command line utilities, so if you needed to do some work on the command line, like managing some files and whatnot, you could certainly do that. But the intention for most of your day-to-day work was really going to be just start an application and do your work there.
Can you explain something for me? Why is it the first drive always seems to be C:?
Well, it's actually because the first drive is A, and that's a floppy. And the original computers had floppy drives, and so you had an A drive and you had a B drive because those were your first and second floppies. And then they added hard drives, and so the hard drive was the first letter after that, and that was C. And they said, well, it's letters, and by the time we get beyond having more letters than that, then we'll have figured something else out. But we're still 2017 now, and we're still using those letters. That's the staying power.
Okay. So let's get a little more practical here. I mean, you've put 20 years now into making this thing, the FreeDOS, be really cool. And I'm sorry for pointing out that that's been 20 years. I'm sure.
Someone else pointed out to me, I've been doing FreeDOS 94 to today longer than MS-DOS was a thing. MS-DOS was a thing in 1981 is when it started, and it died in 1995 when Windows 95 came out. So I've been doing FreeDOS longer than MS-DOS was a thing.
Okay. Well, I applaud you, sir, again for your insanity. That's great. So Microsoft had certain operating system calls, API calls, sys calls, whatever we call them in whatever language it was here. Did you have to? None of this code that you're putting in FreeDOS came from Microsoft in order to keep the copyright straight. So you had to just look at the spec of how these calls were made and try to figure out how to make them work. And were you able to emulate the entire set of system calls, or is there only a subset implemented in FreeDOS?
Yeah. So what we did at the beginning, we were actually very lucky because the intention was there was a guy named Ralph Brown, and he had created this large list of all the interrupts that happened inside MS-DOS. So it was the Ralph Brown interrupt list, and so that provided sort of the clean room documentation. If you just implement what's in that interrupt list, then FreeDOS will operate just like MS-DOS. And that's sort of the gold standard that you kind of go to. Because you can't use any source code from MS-DOS. And we've been very clear about that the entire lifespan here of FreeDOS. There's been some leaks of source code here and there. And Microsoft even opened up the source code to MS-DOS 1. And we said, if you look at that, you can't contribute to FreeDOS, so you need to stay away from that. And we were actually very fortunate at the beginning of FreeDOS in that one of our contributors was Pat Villani. And Pat, before the idea of FreeDOS, had done a lot of embedded systems work. And he created a DOS-like kernel that he could run in embedded systems because it made it easier for him to do development on a DOS machine and then deploy it on this DOS-like kernel. And then he didn't have to do as much porting of the application. And so when I announced FreeDOS, it was around the same time that Pat decided that maybe he didn't need to have this kernel around anymore. And he was talking to the DOSEMU folks, which is that's an PC emulator that is intended to run DOS for Linux. And he talked to them and he said, "Hey, you guys want this kernel?" And they said, "You know who actually would want that kernel is the FreeDOS project. Just go talk to them." And so Pat Villani came to us with this kernel that was pretty much done. I mean, it was a very complete kernel. It didn't do two things. It didn't do networking, and because it didn't do networking, it actually then couldn't do CD-ROMs. And so those were added later. But that's how we got our start with that. Is that it was all original code, and we've been very careful to make sure that it stays original code.
Right. So now, back in those days, I've just been over to my shelf over there and grabbed my boxes. I have my copy of Windows for Workgroups here.
Windows 3.1.1.
So that's Windows 3.1. And of course, back in those days, Windows ran in DOS rather than DOS running in Windows.
Yeah.
So did FreeDOS run Windows back in those days?
So, okay, so you are absolutely correct. Windows ran on top of DOS. Windows at the beginning there, versions 1, 2, and 3, it actually was more of a DOS shell. It ran on top of DOS. And just like you were intended to boot DOS to run a DOS application, you were intended to boot DOS so you could run Windows when Windows became the primary focus. To answer your question, can you run Windows on FreeDOS? It actually is very hard. People have done it, but Windows 3.1.1, the Windows for Workgroups, had some code in it that specifically prevented Windows from running on anything other than an actual Microsoft MS-DOS. And there's a lawsuit that Digital Research picked up by Caldera when their product, when they bought it, that actually sued Microsoft over that because they were actually blocking another DOS because they wanted to block other DOSes from that competing market. So you can run some versions of Windows. It's really, really hard, but it's hard intentionally from the folks in Redmond. So it's not because I think FreeDOS isn't capable of running it. It's just that it's being blocked.
Right. Well, I mean, if they've put in code that explicitly blocks you, that's really quite a compliment, I would have said.
Yeah. It didn't block us specifically. It was blocking DR-DOS at the time. It was blocking, I think, IBM's PC DOS. But it is interesting that Microsoft was trying to protect themselves that much back in the day to try and block other DOS systems from kind of taking off.
So did that then cause you a problem when the world switched, when DOS became a program inside Windows in terms of compatibility? Because I used to be a DOS interrupt programmer back then, and I remember that my TSRs didn't work very. There was this thing called a program that terminated and stayed resident, and was able to simulate multitasking by reactivating itself every now and then. And all of my TSRs stopped working when DOS went inside Windows. Did you? Was that a challenge to the existence of the DOS program for you?
Well, we never really intended to run Windows, and so not being able to run Windows wasn't really a problem. But we did want to make sure that we were able to run all the other DOS stuff that was there, because FreeDOS isn't much of a free DOS if it can't run DOS applications. And so we have focused a lot on making sure that if a program can't run, why can't it run? Is it something that we're blocking? Is it something they're trying to do that it just is expecting a different DOS structure? Certainly the memory structure is different inside FreeDOS than Microsoft's DOS because it was a different development environment. But by and large, we've then tried to just make sure that can programs run, DOS programs run on FreeDOS, and we've been very, very successful. There are some games, and really, when you look at the three different reasons people run DOS today, is going to be reason number one is absolutely going to be to play games, and after that, by the way, you've got people who are going to run legacy DOS software, and you still see that occasionally, and then people who do development on embedded systems, and you still see a little bit of that as well. Then you also get some people who do use it to do BIOS. We're not really installing FreeDOS so you can do a BIOS update. The three reasons are really the games, the business, the legacy software, and the embedded systems. And so games has been something that we see a lot of people using FreeDOS to do. And so games is something that we try to put some focus on. There are some games that don't run under FreeDOS, but it's very rare, and they tend to be very, very old because those games expect to have certain structures inside DOS or MS-DOS, because it was just assuming MS-DOS. But there's just a ton of games, though, that do play really, really well on FreeDOS, and people definitely do run them. Commander Keen, one of my favorites. Doom, Blood, oh God, what else is there? Jill of the Jungle, things like that. There are some games that you today can't actually run without a special utility that we provide in FreeDOS called Slowdown. Because this is a cool thing, is that when DOS was very young, when PCs were very young, games would just assume a CPU speed. And I'd say, well, I'm just going to assume I'm going to run on a machine about this fast. And so the game wouldn't actually look at the clock basically to like figure out how fast the game should run. It would just sort of say, I'm going to run as fast as I'm going to run because I'm expecting to run on CPUs about yay fast, and no one's going to play me after I get after the faster CPUs come out. And so there are some games that make that assumption, and they are unplayable on modern PCs. And so there's a program that we include in FreeDOS called Slowdown, which basically slows your system down intentionally. So that you can play some of these older games that just otherwise would just flip by. You hit the start button and just it's done, and you didn't have a chance to see anything. So that's one of the things that you can do with FreeDOS.
Right. So I remember writing those programs, and we would often go and mess around inside the MS-DOS memory structures to make things happen. The interrupt would give us a hold on reality, but then we would have to go mess around inside memory. So did you have to, when you were writing FreeDOS, emulate MS-DOS data structures and memory structures simply for the sake of compatibility? Did you do a lot of work about compatibility that way?
We had a lot of work on that, yeah. In that we had people, going back to the Ralph Brown interrupt list, and certainly if you make an interrupt call in a certain way, according to how MS-DOS will respond to it, we respond to it in the same way. And so we had a lot of compatibility work going on that way. And then after that, it was finding software that just acted in a weird way. And again, you kind of look at it like, well, is it acting in that weird way? Is it breaking because it's we didn't do an interrupt correctly, or because of some other handler that we didn't do correctly, or it's just because they're expecting like they had insider knowledge into how MS-DOS was organized inside, and they actually were poking specifically, not like at an interrupt, but actually like going to a specific memory address and saying, I want to grab that piece of memory. And that's going to be harder to do because, obviously our memory structures and the way that we've coded it are going to be different from, MS-DOS, but that's just the nature of doing open source software. But it's as I say, it's very, very rare that you'll find some DOS software that doesn't work on FreeDOS.
So how do you run FreeDOS? Back in the day, I've got here my floppy disks for booting DOS on a couple of computers. I used to have them configured with all the settings I needed to run particular programs. How do you run FreeDOS? Is it a program that you run under Windows or under Linux, or do I have to boot into it?
And by the way, with those floppies, I used to work at a university, and I remember using those floppies as an example. So for the younger folks that are maybe watching that haven't used floppies before, that floppy that you're holding up, do you know how much that stores? Not in terms of megabytes, but like in practical day-to-day terms. That's about 1/3 of a song from iTunes.
Yeah, these are about I think these are both 720K discs. These ones.
Oh, are those 720K? Oh my gosh! Wow, that's about half a minute of from iTunes. A song is about about meg a minute on iTunes, and a song is about somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes, and so at about 1.4 megs per floppy, it's about 1/3 of a song of iTunes. And so I remember telling it to somebody, and they're like, "Wow, that was small." I'm like, "Yeah, but it was a lot at the time." And so how do I run FreeDOS? You may not be surprised to know I don't actually run FreeDOS as my desktop operating system every day. That would be something in 2017 to do all my browsing and everything else through DOS. Although I will say FreeDOS can get on the internet. But no, I actually run Linux as my desktop operating system at home, and so I use a PC emulator to run FreeDOS. I use two of them. I use DOS EMU, especially if I need to do some development for FreeDOS, because DOS EMU is a really neat trick where it actually mimics the C drive as a folder on your home directory under Linux, and so you can bring up an actual editor under Linux and edit a file there and save it to that directory, and FreeDOS will just see it magically. And so I use that if I'm going to be doing development. But if I'm not doing development, if I just want to play a game or something else, get the real true booting a computer experience with FreeDOS, I'll actually use a PC emulator called QEMU. And in fact, we got screenshots on our website that every one of them, if they're from me, they're from they're taken inside QEMU.
Right.
And so actually, we recommend.
We did have one viewer who was asking if they should run this up in VirtualBox, which sounds like overkill to me.
You can run it inside VirtualBox. You can run. We actually list a whole bunch of PC emulators on our website. VirtualBox is one of them. DOSEMU, v86, PCM, Java PC. If you want to run inside a web browser, VMware, Virtual PC. There's just a whole bunch of them out there. And so yeah, you can absolutely run FreeDOS in really any PC emulator. And I actually recommend, and I have for a long time, that people run it inside a PC emulator. There's a warning, a little heads up that we give people when you go download FreeDOS and when you try to install it, and it warns you that, hey, if you're installing FreeDOS on a machine that already has an operating system on it, you just need to be careful because years back, I think it was the beta 8 or 9 or something. I got not a ton, but I got some emails after that release that said, I installed FreeDOS on my computer and now Windows won't work. And I'm like, did you actually overwrite Windows? And like, yeah, I went through fdisk and I deleted the thing because I needed more space. And then I added a partition and installed FreeDOS and now Windows won't work. And I'm like, because you deleted Windows. That's why Windows won't work. And so I've recommended ever since that people run FreeDOS inside some sort of a PC emulator, virtual machine, something. Which actually, by the way, is one of the cooler things that I saw when we were getting ready for our FreeDOS 1.2 release, and we were doing our release candidates. Release candidate, I think it was 1. We asked people, download it, test it. And I really wish, I was going to look it up before we did the interview here, but there was a cloud computing company that put an instance of FreeDOS up on the cloud. And so the client that you use to talk to it is just some little desktop client that is basically a PC emulator that talks to a backend on their cloud. And they had installed FreeDOS on the cloud. And so that's one of the cooler things for me about FreeDOS is that somebody has run it on a cloud system.
So is FreeDOS actually opening up any kind of market for more people to use DOS than just the legacy people that are slowly whittling down? Or, I mean, what is this doing in terms of market share of applications and possible things that aren't legacy? I should probably be the way to phrase that.
In terms of new development, excuse me, I don't think you're going to get a lot of new users. I never would kid myself to think that we're suddenly going to replace Linux or something as the next hot operating system, open source operating system. But I do think that we are seeing more people using FreeDOS for sort of retro gaming, classic gaming. It's just what I'm seeing. I'm just seeing a lot more people talking about installing FreeDOS on a gaming machine. So they can play some of these old games, or installing FreeDOS on a PC emulator so they can play some of these old games. And at first I thought, well, these would be the kind of people about my age who kind of grew up with DOS and DOS games, and they kind of remember that really good game from when they were a kid. They want to go back and play, Commander Keen or something. And but actually, no, it turns out you're getting a lot of the newer generation is kind of going in and saying there's some cool retro games that are still good. I mean, they actually have good playability, and they'll fire up an instance of FreeDOS, and they use that to play some old DOS game. And so we do see that quite a bit. And actually, it's because of that gaming that in FreeDOS 1.2, I got talked into we should have games in the distribution finally. I for some reason, today I still can't tell you why I was against it, but for a long time I've been against having games inside FreeDOS. I guess I wanted to be more serious. And so for 1.2, we're like, people use DOS primarily for playing games. There's legacy software and there's embedded systems too, but primarily people are using it to play DOS games. So let's include some DOS games. And so if you look at 1.2, it's got a ton of games on it. And so you don't actually have to go and grab an old classic game. You can just run some of these open source games that we include on the CD.
So, and that brings up the point here, I think, well, one of many points. I have a feeling we're going to run over on this show, so I'm going to have to figure out how to prioritize all the wonderful questions I still have. So the whole DOS era started long before what we would call the modern age of open source, free software, and things like that. I mean, there was this notion of shareware back then, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah.
what is there actually in the body of work that can be run on a DOS machine that's legal to run on a DOS machine?
Well, yeah, as you say, there was this concept of shareware back in the day, and that allowed people to, in fact, it encouraged people to share this program with other people. And if you liked it, so you basically try it before you buy it. And so you get to try it. And usually they encourage you like a month or something before you really should register it. But you just registered it by sending a check, and it was some cheap dollar amount, like $20 or something, to the developer, and they'd send you a code, back through mail and say, here's the registration code, and you got the full version. And so, yeah, shareware was kind of the way to do it. And so you can certainly run a lot of those shareware programs, and that's still a completely legal thing to do. And there are lots of websites out there that have, and we link to several of them that have shareware programs, games mostly. But As Easy as Spreadsheet is also a shareware program. Galaxy Write's a shareware program. You can get some of these shareware, sort of office programs as well and run those. And in fact, Trius Inc., which is the company that made As Easy As, on their website, they actually provide the registration code to get the full version just right away. So you can install As Easy As and just run the full thing. Beyond that, if you have the original software, the install disks or something, you can certainly install those on FreeDOS if you have some way to get it from floppy onto the computer. But there's also a concept of abandonware, which is legal. It's a questionable legal area. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't really comment on that. But basically, the concept behind that is that it's so old that no one's going to come after you for it if you use it. That said, I don't use abandonware, and I don't do any of that. But there's a certain concept out there for a lot of people. When I look at games, like video tutorials on installing classic games or something, they'll actually point to websites where you can pick up abandonware games and something, and you can get the full game of whatever. And they can do that, I guess. But for me, it's a legal questionable area, so I don't really go there.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably the same thing like the JSMS project of running old gaming software, console gaming software, running directly in the browser. Probably has the same and similar issues. We're almost out of time. Strangely enough, I got to get to some of the more important questions about the administration of this project. So, how many people are contributing now? How many people do you think have contributed overall in terms of just headcount? And where are you headed with this? It's clearly a labor of love for you and the people that are working near you. You're not going to set up a company to do FreeDOS support.
Right.
How is that going for you? And what kind of people are you still looking for to still, like it's at its tail end? No, it's not at its tail end. It's still going strong. Where do you want to take this? How do you want to expand this? And what's on your roadmap?
Yeah, we've been having that discussion lately about where should FreeDOS go? What's the next version? And we had that discussion as well when we were getting ready for 1.2. We were talking about what should the next version after 1.1 be 1.2 or should it be a 2.0? And it really kind of came down to this. We said, okay, if it's a 2.0, it's really going to be sort of a quote unquote modern DOS. And for a while we were talking about maybe the next version of FreeDOS should be sort of a modern DOS. Like do a thought experiment where you say, let's imagine into the future what DOS would look like in 2016 if Microsoft hadn't killed the MS-DOS product. If the MS-DOS product was still alive, what would MS-DOS look like? Let's kind of make that. that's a really interesting thought experiment, and it actually gets you somewhere interesting for me, and that is at some point, to remain competitive, Microsoft in the DOS product would have added a flat memory model, because that was a lot of developers were asking for that. They would have added multitasking as part of the operating system, not some bolt-on. You would have had a whole bunch of redesign changes that would have meant that the binaries, you would have had to change the DOS binary standard. And if you do that, you're now losing backwards compatibility. So if you're going to run your old DOS applications, then you'd have to have some sort of a sandbox to run those old applications in the newer MS-DOS. And so that was a thought experiment. It's like, okay, so that's what a modern MS-DOS would look like. And then we said, okay, well, we have that. that is Linux booting up in text mode and running DOS-EMU to run a classic DOS program, because that Linux doesn't have DOS compatibility. But it has a flat memory model. It's got multitasking. It does a whole bunch of other stuff, multi-core CPUs and networking as part of the stack and everything else. And so we say, yeah, we don't need to make a modern DOS. That exists. So the next version of DOS after 1.1 was going to be a 1.2. And so it really was, and I think that really is kind of looking at what the next version will look like. It's going to be more of that. I think we're going to stay in that classic DOS mode. We're talking about what the next version would look like, but it's still kind of early because we just had the release. As to what the next version will look like, it might, I'm asking questions like, do we need to have some of the older compatibility programs in FreeDOS? There's a program that lets you do a screenshot by tapping the print screen key. Well, PC emulators will do that for you automatically, or you run it in Linux or whatever. Your desktop operating system will do that for you. We got other ones that'll let you map a folder to a drive, or actually the other way around. You can map a drive to a folder, because remember back MS-DOS 1 couldn't do folders, and so you had to have these. Everything was a drive, and so to support MS-DOS 1 software, you had to have that feature. And so we got a bunch of these other little things we've added in FreeDOS because we were replicating MS-DOS. But some of them are real sort of legacy compatibility stuff that, as you look at it in 2017, do we really need to have that? And so maybe we talk about taking those out of the core, what we call base, and put that into a separate thing that is basically legacy or compatibility. But you're not changing FreeDOS in any significant way, really. It's still DOS. It still has to be DOS. FreeDOS won't be DOS if it doesn't run DOS programs. If you can't install FreeDOS as a default and using the defaults, and then you can install some software. If you can't do that, then it's not DOS anymore. So we have to be very careful. There's only so much you can do. And so I think the next version of DOS, of FreeDOS, would sort of stay in my expectations today, like a week away from having done our release. I'd say the next version might look very similar to what we've got today, just structured maybe a little differently, a little cleaned up, maybe obviously improved compatibility and bugs and things like that, because it's something you always want to do. But I think that's kind of what the next version would look like. I don't see it changing dramatically and becoming some multitasking thing with networking built in and whatever else, because that's not a DOS system anymore. And a lot of things I expect probably would break if you did that. Just like there was a push to make FreeDOS into a 32-bit operating system, but again, when they did the analysis, they realized that to add the features they wanted to do, it would kind of break DOS compatibility. So we're not really shooting for 32 bits. We're going to stay a 16-bit operating system, and that's fine with us. That's totally fine.
Wait, did you just say 16-bit? Boy, am I old.
Yeah.
What the heck?
Yeah.
Somebody chuckles on this show.
Your files can only get so big, right? Because it's a DOS system. But the great thing about that is it doesn't take a lot of memory. I did a video demo that's on our website of how to install FreeDOS, and I typed in 32 megs for memory, because it's like that's as much space as it needs. That's actually way more than it needs. FreeDOS can boot up in a couple of megs. That's about it. I only gave it a 200 meg hard drive, and it could get by much fun.
I saw that. I was noticing on the QEMU screenshots, it was only 200 meg. And I wonder,
Yeah.
I think I've got enough room on my disk to emulate this thing. That'd be pretty straightforward. Also, I think since you're now at 1.2, you should strongly consider doing, was it Don Knuth's thing where he just kept adding digits of E to the release number? So it could be 1.21 and 1.2.18 and 1.2183 like that. Or 2.8 again, I guess. I don't know.
We will look into that. I did the same thing with a version of our install program way back when. It was I got to version 3 and I got to version 3.1 and then I got to 3.11, 12, 13.14, and then after that I said, well, let's just make it Pi. And
awesome. Awesome indeed. So you covered the roadmap pretty well. I think we skipped over though. Who's contributed and what's the size of your current contribution base?
It's obviously a lot smaller now than it was back in the late 90s, early 2000s. That was probably our peak when we had lots and lots and lots of people working on it. Today, it's probably, when I look at the mailing list, who's contributing and who pops in here and there, I would say that we've got a couple of dozen developers. Maybe 30, 40 developers actively plugging away at it. So it's fairly small in terms of, if you compare it to something like Linux or a GNOME or something like that. But it's still fairly large for when you consider a system that started in 1994 and is this niche operating system. I think that's still pretty big.
Yeah, and if you ever had a meetup of everybody that's working on it?
We haven't actually. We have a lot. They all work around the world, and so the short answer is no, because it's really hard to get people together. But whenever I travel, and for work or even holidays, I'll put a word out there and I'll say, hey, anybody going to be in Chicago, or anybody going to be in where? And I actually have met several folks that I have only talked with over email about on the FreeDOS project, and so I have met a handful. I would say I've met probably 3, 4, 5 people in person from the FreeDOS project, and talked to one other on the phone. And so, but meetups, no, meetups are kind of hard.
Well, and clearly there's been no pressure to fork this, right?
No, there's not really. There was an effort at one time that group trying to make the 32-bit, but no. Other than that, no. There's not been a lot of interest to fork it. I think we did a pretty good job actually of keeping the group together. People. We don't tolerate trolls on our mailing list, for example, and so it's not even something I have to I don't have to put the ban hammer on anybody. I haven't had to do that. I think I've done that once, maybe twice over our history. People have actually kind of policed themselves pretty well. Somebody does something and somebody else will step in and say, hey, you should kind of tone that down a little bit. Maybe it helps that we're all a bit older because we're, we started doing DOS development, most of us, back in the day. And maybe it helps that we're we've kind of grown out of it a little bit, but that's just a guess.
Well, I'm sure somebody's going to come along and probably, if they haven't done this already, run this all through one of those C compilers that feeds directly into JavaScript and get this running in a browser somewhere, or somebody already done that?
You can actually. There's a web-based emulator. Oh gosh, what's it called? The PCJS is one of them. Java PC is another one, and you can actually run that emulator in your web browser, and we link to that off of our website. And so if you want to run a version of FreeDOS that has, I think they come with games and stuff that you can play, you can absolutely do that. You don't actually have to install it. You can just let it go. Oh my gosh, somebody, it looks like, has OpenGem up on the screen.
Oh my God! Yeah. So if you're not watching the video, this is looking like as I imagine a DOS window would look. So, like I said, I don't have much experience with it, but this looks like it's doing something. It's running calendaring software or something.
Yeah, that looks I think that's OpenGem. Yeah, that's OpenGem, and the that is an open source software version of the Gem desktop system.
And awesome.
And it's, Gem was very simple, as you can see. It's very black and white. There we also provide, so that's one of the ones that we provide, graphical desktops we provide in the FreeDOS 1.2 distribution. We also have Seal, and what's the other one? Ozone, both of which are full color ones, and they look a lot like a modern desktop operating system.
Okay, now is there any questions? We're almost out of time. Is there any questions we didn't ask that you wanted to make sure our audience is aware of, or any call for action that you'd like to make?
So it's interesting to me, just to share that, FreeDOS got a lot of attention on FreeDOS 1.2. Before that, I record our stats ever since we released the 1.1 distribution back in the beginning of 2012, and we've had peak months and whatnot, but for the last couple of years, it's been around 30,000 downloads a month, so about 1,000 downloads a day. We broke records with 1.2, and so please go ahead and continue that and grab it again. The new version of FreeDOS has since the last week when we released it, we had over 45,000 downloads in just the last week. For the entire, that plus the FreeDOS 1.2 release candidate 2, the last test release that we had before we actually the final version, both of those together, we had over 85,000 downloads in the whole month of December. I mean, so and right now we've settled down. We're to about it looks like between 3,000 and 4,000 a day in the last couple of days here. And I think it's probably going to stay there for a while. But it's really amazing to see so many people grabbing the new version of FreeDOS. I think it says something that there's definitely some untapped interest and people being able to run some of these older DOS programs and DOS games, and you can do that now with FreeDOS. So I think we did something right there in 1.2.
I actually have one other curiosity question. I shouldn't be asking this because we're already right up against the end of the show, but is there any modern hardware that can run Windows that would not be able to not be able to boot FreeDOS?
Yes, that actually is becoming a problem in that FreeDOS, like any DOS, requires two things. It requires an Intel CPU and it requires a BIOS. And so I get questions all the time about, can FreeDOS run on my Raspberry Pi? Well, it's not going to run natively. If you have some sort of PC emulator, yeah, you can do that. But I don't know of any that run on Raspberry Pi. I just don't know. I haven't looked. And the BIOS is the other problem, because what you're getting a lot now are computers that don't have a BIOS. They have UEFI. And UEFI can include a BIOS emulation, but a lot of them now just don't. And so you are starting to see more computers today that because they don't have that BIOS, they're not going to run FreeDOS, and you will have to run an emulator to run some sort of PC emulator, or a virtual machine to run FreeDOS, because you're not going to run it on the bare hardware. That said, I don't know that of a lot of people that are going to grab a machine today that's got a couple terabytes of hard disk and how many gigs of memory, that FreeDOS may not be able to address that whole thing anyway, because it's built for a different era. So I don't know, many people are going to buy a completely new system, brand new system, just to run FreeDOS on it. For that, we see people who are running on bare hardware. We're seeing people that have the Pentium computer, the 46 computer from a couple years ago that they never got rid of, that they're going to turn into a gaming machine.
Okay, well, like I said, we're almost out of time, and I think we could go another hour easily, given the collective geekness and the history that the three of us have. So without further ado, I want to thank you for being on the show and having probably another 5,000 downloads pretty quickly here within the next couple of days because of this show. Jim Hall, it's been wonderful chatting with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great.
Awesome. That was Jim Hall, the owner and creator of FreeDOS, along with many, many other people who've contributed over the years, and 20 years in the making, one of the longest open source projects that we have interviewed on this show. What do you think there, Simon?
Oh, it's been a blast from the past. I've been getting out all the old boxes and the floppy drives, wondering whether the way to get access to my old WordPerfect documents is actually to run WordPerfect in FreeDOS. I love that those things exist, and it's really important that they do exist, because there's a huge piece of our heritage which relies on access to old operating systems like DOS. And FreeDOS is doing a really important job of allowing us to remain connected to parts of our past that would otherwise disappear. It's hard enough using the stuff on these disks as it is, because the file formats are all broken. But I ran into some floppy disks just now where, to get access to the data on the disk, I'm actually going to have to run a DOS program. And so this evening after dinner, I'm going to download FreeDOS and run up some of the programs which I have thoughtfully included on the floppy disk. So I've actually got them on the disk with the data.
Nice.
I think it's extremely important that they're doing this stuff, and I'm really pleased to see they're keeping it up to date.
Awesome. I mean, that is one of the problems I've actually, archaeologists are looking at. Well, what's going to be available to the archaeologists of the future, given our technology, rapidly moving forward? Because we now have disks that we can't read. We now have data stored in formats that is proprietary, locked up software. On top of the problems of just simply reading the magnetic media or optical media, or, man, I still have sitting in my shelf somewhere a magop drive. Let's see if I can get something that'll even talk to that, let alone, be able to read it, because they were nice dense storage that was sort of a nice interim between modern hard disks and the legacy floppies and things. So how do we manage all that? This is really amazing. By the way, we had somebody in the chat room actually when you were holding up your floppies said that those were save icons. What's he doing holding up save icons? Because again, the kids haven't seen these floppies perhaps, and so they see this as an icon that we all recognize, we geezers all recognize as being, this is where data was stored. So of course we click on that to save the data to disk, because that was what a disk looked like back in the day. I also, a couple of people in the chat room brought up that SpinRite is running by our friend Steve Gibson, who runs Security Now, which is coming up after this show if you're on the live stream. I presume it is then. SpinRite ships with FreeDOS. So apparently it boots FreeDOS as its way of getting the operating system up and running so that it can then talk away from having anything on the hard drive that has to count on. So I thought that was sort of interesting. And also one other note I made during the show, which was that the shareware that was being made available actually had a website for the unlock code. And I thought, well, no, there's a mix of cultures. Here's something back from when we had BBS systems with modems that ran 14.4 as being the fastest modem that most people had, sharing shareware. And then today you would go to www.something to pull out the activation code for that shareware. Any final thoughts before we wrap up here, Sim?
Well, one other thing to say to people is, if this is fascinating to you, you really ought to go onto the Internet Archive at archive.org and have a look at their software archive. They have a lot of these DOS games and DOS programs available on archive.org, and you can actually run them in your web browser, so you don't have to run up a machine specially to try them out. Go have a look. Go see how we used to live back in the 1980s with all this DOS software, and with the very earliest GUI software, where the GUI was drawn using characters and little blocky images rather than using the kind of fancy raster images that came along with Windows. Go to archive.org and have a look at the software archive, and I think you'll get hooked as you dig in there and see how things used to be.
And please help fund archive.org. I mean, that's basically, it's a nonprofit that lives on your donations. And I know a lot of really, really great people that are working there that are taking care of things like this. So coming up, though, speaking of old software and new software, we have next week, I won't be here. I will be out on a cruise ship, a Star Trek cruise, which is why I'm wearing my red shirt today, because I know I'm not going to be wearing this at all next week because I don't want to be the red shirt on a Star Trek cruise. It does not sound like a good thing to be. But next week, Aaron has graciously agreed to be the host once again, stepping into the big chair for me. We're going to talk about Open HMD, which is head-mounted displays. So like the Oculus Rift and other things that are related to that, having sort of a common interface. So you can write the same code that runs everywhere across all those, and open source code for all that. In fact, following that, I will be back talking about Open NMS, which is carrier-grade network monitoring, I think like Nagios and stuff, but on a much higher scale, much cooler scale. PG Backrest, which is the online backup and restore for Postgres to allow you to back up your online transactions database. Eclipse Shea, which is a developer workspace server and cloud IDE. It's what CodeEnvy runs commercially, but the entire source is available so you can run your own locally, which is really nice. So we're talking to the head of CodeEnvy to bring that on. Just added to the schedule, might probably be like the last week or so, Gadgetron, which has absolutely no meaning in the term. So what it is medical image reconstruction. Now, when I broke my arm, they gave me this floppy disk, and they gave me some software that would actually run to actually look at the data structure, speaking of data structures that we don't have readers for, to actually be able to see this broken arm photos, right? So Gadgetron is an attempt to make, not an attempt, it's working really well, open source implementation of that to read all the common formats that are being used by proprietary software, kicked out by proprietary software that your doctor is using, things like that. To be able to read that data and take ownership of your own medical history. So this is very important. Following that, Arduino, we had them on like 6 or 7 years ago, and bringing them back to give you updates. Boy, there's going to be a ton of updates on that show as well. Nothing else on the list at the moment, but if you go to twit.tv/floss, you can find out how we're doing. Again, if you have any other suggestions, please tell the project leader or community coordinator to email me, merlin@stonehenge.com. The homepage for the show, twit.tv/floss, will have my email address in case you forget it. We are currently booking the middle of Q2, trying to get some more bookings in there. We have a live stream. We took some questions from it at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time on Tuesdays at live.hoot.tv. If you want to contribute to that, Pacific time being whatever time it happens to be on the west coast of the U.S. Changes back and forth with daylight savings time. And I hate that, but that's the way it is. Same time as Second Life time, by the way. So Second Life Standard Time is, in fact, the same as twit.tv time, which is funny. All right. You follow us at Floss Weekly on Google+, and at Floss Weekly on Twitter. You follow me at Randall L. Schwartz on Google+, or that tweets over to Merlin, MERLYN. I am currently scheduling to be at both YAPC, which is going to be in Florida, I think, this year. No, not Florida, somewhere Research Triangle, out that direction instead. OSCON also, that's going to be in Austin again this year. And hopefully DragonCon in September, and FISLE down in Porto Alegre, Brazil, probably in July or August, I think it is, something like that. And possibly FOSDEM, not this upcoming one in a few weeks, but I think I'm going to actually start planning on being at the one next year. I haven't ever been, and I hear great things about it, and I think maybe I should add it to my list. I know, Simon, you've been to that a few times, so anything else you want to plug as well, or maybe a chat about FOSDEM?
Yeah, I'm just planning now for FOSDEM. I'll be in Brussels from the 2nd through the 6th of February for FOSDEM. FOSDEM itself happens on the 4th and 5th. But it's become such a big event now that it's attracting other events on the adjacent days. And there's a whole load of little mini conferences on February the 3rd. In particular, there's one about free software metrics that I will be trying to go to. And we also have the name FOSDEM is the Free and Open Source Developers European Meeting. And as a consequence, there's a lot of projects have their annual meeting, so to speak, at FOSDEM, and we'll be having the board of directors meeting for the Document Foundation, who is the organization that makes LibreOffice. We'll be meeting there. So if you want to meet the developers of pretty much any major open source free software project, you'll find them in Brussels on the 4th and 5th of February. FOSDEM is especially good because it's completely free of charge. There's no need to spend any money other than to get to Brussels. And Brussels is quite inexpensive to get to in February because there's absolutely no other reason on earth why you would want to go there at that time of year. Trust me.
Brr.
So do come along.
Yes. Well, definitely. And we'll, for those of you that are at FOSDEM, be sure to go hunt Simon down and say hi. And someday you'll see me there. And not someday, probably a year from February. It wouldn't just be an arbitrary day. That would be a little strange. Anyway, so we're running over. So we'll see you all again next week. Oh, wait, before I say that, thank you, Simon, for stepping in to be the co-host for this show. It's been a long time since you've been on the show, and I'm glad you're back.
It's my pleasure. It's given me the opportunity to get all my floppy disks out and see what's on them. So.
Awesome. So we'll see you all again next week on FLOSS Weekly.